Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very excited about this panel today. My name is Charlotte Crosswell. I'm on the board of Centre for Policy Studies, and I'm also chair and trustee of Open Banking Limited. But more importantly, I would like to turn to my great panellists today, introduce them quickly by name, and then they will be giving opening remarks on the topic that we have. Hopefully you are here to listen to can we have free trade in services as well as goods, a subject close to my heart as well, so very much looking forward to hearing from the panel. So to my left, we have Catherine McGuinness, who I'm sure needs no introduction, Stephen King, Senior Economic Advisor to Hsbc. We've got Samaya Keynes, Britain Economics Editor at The Economist, and Dr. Rebecca Harding, CEO of Coriolis Technologies. So welcome to all of you. So Catherine, if it's okay with you, I'm going to turn to you first for some opening remarks.
Thanks very much, and I'll try to avoid repeating exactly what I said at the beginning of the day. I must say it's been an absolutely fascinating day so far from the bits I've been able to see. I think my answer, in essence, would be yes, but we need to think of a different range of mechanisms. The UK really does have a huge opportunity to liberalise trade around the world by taking a global and holistic approach to services and goods trade. And I'm sure that's been underlined by what people have been discussing in the rest of the day. Free trade agreements can be very useful in establishing regulatory dialogue mechanisms and locking in existing arrangements. And indeed, we've seen, for example, the UK-Japan Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement and provisions there. But they don't typically facilitate enormous amounts for services trade. There are other mechanisms that we need to explore. So I would suggest, as indeed I did this morning, that we need to be looking at what we can do around cross-border relationships based on dialogue, based on the mutual recognition of regulatory outcomes, and built on trust between regulators. I think the work that's ongoing with Switzerland on a mutual recognition agreement, for example, has the potential to become a real gold standard for financial and professional services agreements. And it is, I should say, particularly from the financial and related professional services angle that I'm looking at this. I think an agreement of that type could help establish alignment and build towards a global coherence. I think it could be particularly useful in the context of climate regulation, for example, where we're really keen to see, we are advocating a process to guarantee progress towards a working sort of a climate regulatory framework that would operate across borders. I think what I'd say as a bottom line is that if we're going to get dialogues of this sort, regulatory cooperation of this sort to work, then we need a meaningful business engagement to underpin it. We need to be looking at business engagement as we create mechanisms. I do think that with cooperation between regulators, with engagement of business in the mechanisms, we could really be looking at shaping a coherent international policy agenda that would help the UK to reap the wholesale benefits of global free trade. Something that we in the City Corporation are very focused on as we engage with other parts of the world. We see a huge opportunity from financial and professional services trade with markets across the world, including the US, Australia and Japan, and indeed I think we'll discuss in a bit actually, Charlotte, where we go with our EU partners into the future, given our new footing with them. There are multiple opportunities here. Opportunities not just for financial and professional services in themselves as an export, but actually in the businesses that they help to support here at base. We drew attention to those opportunities in a report earlier this year, an ecosystem enabling international trade, looking at the mutuality between services and trade. A business that wants to manufacture to export its goods needs the services to support it, to bring those goods to market, to enter into the agreements and the financing, whatever that they need then to export. So there's a real synergy here that we ought to be drawing on. So we would really be keen to see services included in trade agreements, but we would also be very keen to see other mechanisms used to ensure that barriers are reduced, opportunities are increased, and regulatory fragmentation is avoided where possible. So I think there's a winning potential combination here that's good for the UK, good for trade, and good for financial and professional services, provided, I would say, Charlotte, we can orchestrate this properly.
Great.
So that's my introduction for you.
Thank you, Catherine. Stephen, if I can turn to you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I wanted to kick off with just some very simple observations about how important services trade is for the UK and how it's become increasingly important over time. So if you go back to 2000, about 33% of Britain's total exports in 2000 was exports of services. That 33% has now risen to about 47, 48%. So in the space of 20 years, the importance of services has risen quite dramatically. Secondly, when you look at where those services exports go to currently, there's a huge bias towards what you might describe as relatively rich developed nations. So a big chunk goes to the EU, a slightly smaller chunk goes to the US, but those two in combination account for about 65% or so of our service exports. The third thing I would note is that as the world changes over the next 20 or 30 years, it is likely that demand for Britain's services will shift away from Europe and the US in a relative sense, not in an absolute sense, but in the relative sense, because of the nature of economic development in other parts of the world. And the simple point here is that when you get incomes per capita rising to somewhere between $15,000 and $25,000 per year, at that point, an economy tends to shift away from simply consuming goods and the sort of bare essentials towards consuming a wide variety of different services, whether it be professional services, financial services, mortgages, pension, consumer credit, and so on. Those things tend to kick in. So when you think about where we are in 20 years' time, the UK has a tremendous opportunity to engage with the likes of China, India, other parts of Asia, other parts of the world. We shouldn't lose sight in any negotiations that Britain has in the future that these are places that will become much more important in the future than they are today. The second thing I would note is that when it comes to services, they actually are really quite ill-defined. The relationship between goods and services is very, very blurred for a variety of different reasons. But one example is obviously you sell a jet engine. You're selling a jet engine which is an export of a good, but at the same time you're offering a service contract with it that may go on for the next few years. So the idea that goods and services are separate entities, they sort of exist in separate bubbles, is certainly a reflection of the bureaucracy of the negotiations, but it isn't necessarily a reflection of what's going on in real life. Another example of the same kind of blurring is the digitization of goods and services in recent times. So a very current example is Adele's latest album. If you buy it in vinyl or you buy it as a CD, that counts as a good. If you download it through Spotify or through iTunes or whatever, it counts as a service. And if you export it on that basis, then you've got a distinction. But in actual truth, in terms of your experience of listening to Adele's album, unless you're a real hi-fi geek and you really care about vinyl, the reality is that your experience is going to be much the same, regardless of the delivery mechanism that comes through. So in broad terms, I would say that when it comes to any future view about services, it is important to recognize that goods and services, in one sense, are slightly bundled with each other. Final point I wanted to make at the beginning is that with goods, people obviously are involved in terms of their manufacture, and capital goes in search of those people, whether those people exist in Britain, or whether they exist in China, or India, or Brazil, or the US, or wherever it might be. Service is slightly different, because whereas with goods you go in search of people, your capital that goes across borders, in the case of services, it's often the people coming across borders to go to where the capital happens to be. And that, I think, is important from a negotiating perspective. It's not good enough for Britain simply to say, we want to sort of export our services everywhere else because we're class-leading, we're world-beating, or whatever else. There also has to be a recognition that others will want to sell their services into Britain. And this is where I think it becomes complicated, Because if on the one hand you say actually it's important that we sort of control freedom of movement, that people can't come across borders so easily, well, that's absolutely fine to say that. But there has to be a recognition that by doing that, you are probably restricting the amount of services trade you can do. And so there comes a sort of constraint or a conflict between the interests of sovereignty with regard to freedom of movement and the degree to which trade can be open through services, because services do reflect the movement of people across borders. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Samaya.
Great. Hello. Good afternoon. So the title of this session is, can we have free trade in services as well as goods? And my answer is no. We can't. We can potentially have freer trade in services, but there are all sorts of reasons why services are just really, really difficult to trade. And it's worth keeping those in mind when we embark on our liberalisation agenda. And I think the first difficulty is actually knowing what trade and services is. Stephen alluded to the measurement difficulties, the definitional difficulties. Now, if you really want to geek out, there are 4 modes of services. Some argue there's a 5th, but we don't need to talk about that here. So essentially, you think of cross-border trade and services. You might think of a foreign student coming to learn in a British university. You might think of a British bank selling insurance overseas. You might not think of Mode 3 services, which is a UK company with an affiliate in a country, somewhere in a foreign country, selling domestic services in that market. That counts as services exports. It's a bit weird because if you had a goods producer, so supposing you had a British car manufacturer, and they've got an affiliate in China, and that affiliate is selling cars to the Chinese market, that wouldn't show up as goods trade. But if they're selling a service to that Chinese market, that gets counted in the official figures. So you really, when thinking of services trade, we're also really talking about international investment and what could make that easier. So services is it's very difficult to measure. I was talking to someone from a large digital multinational, and he was actually in charge of telling the government what that particular company was trading cross-border. Now, this is a big company, and he told me, he said, what I tell the government, those numbers, they bear no resemblance to what a normal human would think of as cross-border trade in these digital services that this company is managing. You know, he said there are various rules that I have to follow, but it's just not intuitive at all. So for things other than travel, logistics, education, things that are fairly tangible, it can just get very, very murky when you've got these big multinationals providing these digital services all around the world. It's just very difficult to count that. And that obviously matters because as a trade negotiator, you want to go out there and say, okay, well, where is there most trade and where is there least trade? What are the barriers? Who's important? And that lack of data, those problems with the data make that exercise much, much more difficult than it is for trading goods, where because we apply tariffs, actually everything is quite well measured. Now, I'm not suggesting that we go and start trying to apply tariffs to services trade to be able to measure it, although I know several trade geeks who would really like that. But it's just the point is that there's this informational barrier. So that's one problem. So the question then is, okay, well, let's talk about how we get more trade in services. How do we get freer trade? And the answer is with difficulty. If the plan is to dismantle other countries' barriers to services trade. Now, the UK is actually very open to trade and services. If you look at the OECD, they've got this index of restrictiveness of trade and services. And the UK performs pretty well on lots of measures. So, you know, well done UK if the objective is to be open. Unfortunately, if you want to then cut down other people's barriers, that can present an issue of leverage. So I think if you say, okay, fine, we're going to do that, we're going to try and cut down other countries' barriers to trade, the fundamental high-level problem is that you don't have tariffs restricting trading goods. You've got all sorts of other things. You've got non-tariff barriers. And often, almost always, those are not put in place to protect the domestic industry only. They're put in place for some other reason. So take financial services. You know, foreign regulators might be uncomfortable about just completely opening the market and having lots of financial flows that they don't have control over, right? And so that's a legit reason to be nervous about liberalizing trade in financial services. Often, actually, if you look at free trade agreements and agreements covering trade in services, financial services are often excluded from those deals. And so the problem is, okay, well, how can you, dismantle those if you haven't got sort of basic, blatant protectionism, if there are good reasons for these trade barriers? And, the answer is you need to have dialogues between different regulatory agencies. And then the problem is that it all just becomes very, very tedious. It's just very boring. You've got all these very minute, dull barriers to individual industries. You can't, you can talk about tariffs in this very grand way. You can aggregate them in some sense. It's very, very difficult to talk about barriers to trade and services in a broad, meaningful way. Now, just to finish, I thought for my opening remarks, I would go out and I would see what other countries complain about when they talk about exporting services and trade with the UK. So very helpfully, the US every year publishes something called the National Trade Estimates, where they essentially list all of the things that they're annoyed about. And they have this very helpful section called the United Kingdom, where they list all the things that they're irritated by that the United Kingdom does. So just to give you some examples of these peeves, one complaint was that government-issued student loans cannot be issued for international degrees, right? So the British government is not offering student loans for students to go and study in American universities. That's a trade barrier. Now, we can start to think through the politics and even the economics of whether that would be a good thing, whether to liberalize trade, the British government should start funding loans to go to American universities. I suspect that might be quite difficult to get through. Another one is that they were annoyed about the cap on foreign medical students allowed in the UK, which means that actually they're annoyed that they can't import education services from Britain. That's another pet peeve. And then the final one that I'll mention is that they are upset that in order to get permission to act as a chartered accountant, you have to have professional experience in the UK, creating a sort of chicken and egg situation. Well, how on earth are you meant to get that experience if you can't go to the UK? But again, you can see if you were, some kind of regulator in the UK, you might want an accountant to have experience in the system, before they could practice, right? And so the point is that there are reasons for all of these barriers, which makes them extra difficult to dismantle. And with that, I will close.
Thank you, Samir. Food for thought there. Rebecca.
Sure. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak. Can we have free trade in services? Well, we've already had a quite unequivocal answer to that question, and I think I'd kind of agree with you and then say, well, actually, to some extent, the reason why we have issues with measuring services is because everybody defines it in a different way, and we can see that in the data itself. So if we look at trade data itself, one of the things that you see quite remarkably is the fact that Germany thinks it's doing more financial services trade with us, exporting more to us, than we think we're importing from Germany. That is actually a really big problem in measuring trade. That type of asymmetry where one country says, well, this is how we define services, and you're defining it in a mildly different way, but we think we're exporting more. So you've got irregularities across the whole world and asymmetries across the whole world in terms of how you measure all of this. And we've all talked about that to some extent. But one of the things that I found most interesting in what you said, Catherine, was the fact that you talked about, and Stephen as well, about how manufacturing and services are integrated together. And if you look at the services data for UK trade. Manufacturing as a service is one of the fastest growing areas of UK trade. In other words, we're moving from just being a manufacturing base towards having much higher levels of services integrated and intellectual property as well integrated into our manufacturing. At this point, I stop being an economist and start being a business owner. You'll be very glad to know. Reason why is because I'm starting to talk about something that's very close to my heart, which is data. And one of the things that's happening across the whole trade space, and something that is part of UK government policy, and if we are going to form trade agreements that include the way in which trade is developing, we have to think about digitisation. And that's trade facilitated by digital means. It's how our information crosses borders. So it's not just about how money crosses borders, but it's about how information, so 3D printing and all of those sorts of things, but also how we enable trade to happen through greater digitisation. So there are several key issues there. If we're going to have more digitisation, then that actually has a huge benefit to small businesses, because it means that processes are quicker, accessing trade finance is quicker, everything becomes cheaper for small businesses because we have cross-border trade facilitation, through going across customs is cheaper, but also organising trade finance is cheaper and quicker. So companies that currently find it difficult to trade will find it easier through that digitisation process. But then we have some issues that we need to think about. We need to think in our trade arrangements, we need to think about data protection. We need to think about who owns the data and where that data is hosted. And I think that in free trade agreements is something that is incredibly important. We then need to think about intellectual property. Now, you said that the main barrier to understanding and measuring free trade in services is non-tariff barriers. Can we start to put tariffs on code, for example? There are arguments at WTO level, as I'm sure you know, to say we should start putting tariff barriers and actual tariffs on code, and sharing code should have something that has a fee attached to it. How far do we want to go down those types of roads? Then the other thing is that we also need to think about the legal framework for trade. And this is where we need to think about what types of documents and what types of data we're prepared to have in terms of enabling our services trade. And I think one of the reasons why free trade agreements tend to have fairly limited clauses on services at the moment is just the complexity of all of this. If you look at what the World Trade Organization has been struggling with for the last 5 or 6 years, it's actually been that process of understanding how to deal with digitization and services trade, because it's complicated. And as we start to see the regulations develop around sustainability, companies needing to track their supply chains to tier 3, tier 4, tier 5, just because they've got to comply with financial reporting around their supply chains and financial disclosures around sustainability, that means that the world has suddenly become incredibly complicated, and you need digital solutions to all of that. So I'd say, where are the risks and what are we going to do about it? Well, first of all, let's define services as broadly as we can and find appropriate solutions to all of the different aspects of services. Manufacturing as a service is as important as AI, is as important as digital, is as important as our local restaurant round the corner. And that's an area where we're not thinking, and there are all sorts of issues, including movement of people, movement of ideas, movement of data across borders. So I think this is a hugely interesting area, actually, and I've probably just opened up a can of worms, so thank you very much indeed for listening.
Thank you, Rebecca. And you've obviously had a range of views. I'm hoping that Samir hasn't completely finished our panel early by saying no. But I mean, what a complicated world this is. And I think when people think about trade in services, and probably many around this room think about trade in financial services, I think it just shows the level of complexity there is. let's talk about sort of priorities in trade negotiation, because we've already had a long list here. Nothing of which is easy to fix. And where should we be going with regulatory dialogues? So perhaps, Stephen, I can start with you on that.
Well, I think some of the issues that have been raised already by the panel are directly relevant here. So one, which again reflects this idea of people moving across borders, is having an agreement as to what a professional qualification happens to be and whether the qualification is shared in different countries. So is a doctor from all countries? Is a doctor coming from country A the same standard as a doctor coming from country B? Can you be confident that the university structure in different countries is roughly the same? And the answer really is we're not sure. There's no formal agreement as to what those qualifications should be. It's difficult enough within Europe, let alone the rest of the world. That in turn feeds through to all sorts of other issues which are not directly connected with services. But when you have sort of, for example, a migrant crisis and you say, well, actually there are people coming in who have qualifications, you come back to the same issue, which is what are the qualifications? Are they like for like with qualifications of the country that you happen to be living in yourself, or are they different? So I think that kind of issue of standardization, or at least agreement as to what counts as a qualification and what doesn't count as a qualification is important. I think experience also is relevant, going back to this idea of accountancy and the idea of whether someone can come and work directly in a particular country which may have its own specific accountancy rules. That again is tricky. You might need some experience to work out what's going on before you can actually do that job, even though you have a certificate that tells you that in theory you can do that job. Another, I think, important issue. And another issue I think is important, particularly for my own industry, i.e. financial services, actually springs out of the global financial crisis. And after the global financial crisis, understandably, regulators in individual countries said, we need to make sure that we're looking after the interests, in particular, of our country's taxpayers. And in the process of creating regulations to look after the interests of national taxpayers, you ended up probably with some degree of balkanization of financial regulation across different countries. Again, it's entirely understandable why it happened. You can see why in the UK there'll be a particular emphasis on looking after the interests of taxpayers given the size of the financial system compared with the size of the economy, which is much bigger than might be true of, say, the US. But at the same time, when you have that balkanization of financial regulation, it becomes much more difficult to have a level playing field to have a discussion as to where you're going with services trade in the future. So in each of these cases, there's basically a difference between the interests of free trade and the interests of sovereignty and the relevance of various regulations which are chosen for specifically national purposes, which may not be consistent with a broader ambition of free trade in services. Now, the final example of this, I think it's Australia, but someone else on the panel will probably correct me, and it's associated with cigarettes, and I think particularly Philip Morris, if I recall, which is that Australia, I think, wanted to basically get rid of branding altogether and say, we're happy to sell cigarettes, but there'll be no brands. So if you go into your local shop and buy a packet of cigarettes, it'll be just a blank package, and that's what you're going to buy. And that was taken, I think, to WTO on the basis that it was an infringement of free trade and an infringement of the brand rights of the tobacco manufacturer. Now, there are arguments on both sides of that, but you can see from an Australian perspective why they might think, well, actually, the health of our people is more important than a free trade principle in terms of services. So when you have these differences that are there for non-trade reasons, but are there for good domestic political reasons, then it goes back to Samaya's comment that effectively this is something which becomes very difficult to deal with because you get involved in tedious discussions which don't really go very far, because at the end of the day, the sovereignty is more important in these areas than the principle of free trade.
Thank you. I mean, Catherine, obviously, I know you want to take a huge amount of regulatory dialogue on behalf of the Square Mile and further afield. What format do you think we can play in moving this forward?
Well, I think there is a role for free trade agreements here in setting up the expectation that there will be ongoing regulatory dialogue, but then there is a question of getting into the detail of the tedious and what it is that makes it difficult for services to flow across borders. And I think it is a very fair challenge that what we're aiming for here is freer flows rather than free flows, for all the reasons that people have put together so well. But I think it's a goal that we need to be aiming for, particularly at the moment, because there are global challenges that we need to meet, whether it's recovery, whether it's the climate challenge, which makes it important not just for trading reasons that we do liberalise flows as far as we possibly can. I think what we would be looking for from the dialogue is how one can remove unnecessary frictions in present arrangements. Where is it that trusting regulators can work together to respect each other's regulatory outcomes? How can we then develop regulatory responses for the future on new challenges? And I think here particularly of something like the climate challenge, where go back to definitions, the current definitions of environmental services in trade terms are just hopeless for some of the issues that we're really currently looking at. So it's, I think, a question of how can we work together bilaterally or else multilaterally to develop common responses and approaches which will enable some of the services that we're going to need to meet these challenges to work appropriately across border. One thing I would say is that when you think about the length of time it takes to strike free trade agreements, even if you could cover the detail in the agreements themselves, you actually want the dialogues to carry on alongside those, and whatever other mechanisms one can find, because we might be able to make quicker advances doing that. And I would just flag again the arrangement we're about to strike with Switzerland, which I think will be a model of its kind. And I think there are some interesting developments across some of the trade agreement negotiations that we have at the moment that I would hold up, of the digital space, for example.
Mr. Mayor, do you want to come in on this? It's an interesting question of how do we tackle it, and what do we put first?
So I think, so I think the one thing that you need is trust, right? If I'm right, and these things just really can involve some really tricky domestic politics, what you need is trust between both sides, that one side isn't going to, undercut the other, or something like that. And so you need trust between countries so that dialogue is constructive and healthy. You also need trust within countries. Now, trade negotiations can be great because what you can do is you can make a sausage, and in the sausage you give away some things, and in the sausage you get some things in return, and it all kind of gets wrapped up into this bundle, and overall you're better off. And one of the problems when negotiating services in trade agreements is that you've got, just thinking about the mechanics of this, right? So you've got a trade negotiating bit of government, and then you've got all the other bits of government that think that, no, I make this bit of the sausage. This is my bit of the sausage, and no, trade negotiator, you can't go off and negotiate random things. You can't trade me off against that other bit. And so to make that process effective, you need a really high level of trust and communication on your domestic side, right? You need everyone to be talking to each other. Now, I'll take America as an example where take the Treasury, right? A very, very powerful department in America, and sometimes a department not exactly thrilled for USTR to be going off and negotiating lots of financial services commitments, right? The Treasury sees that as its domain. And so that can be a challenge, right? And you can easily apply that to the UK, where, to be fair, we've only recently started, building our trade negotiating apparatus. But that kind of trust domestically is just really, really important. And if it's not there, then of course the people you're negotiating with can see that, and then they can kind of play different bits of the sausage. I'm not sure the sausage metaphor works. I'm really sorry, guys. But it's too late now. Yeah, I think that's what I'd say. Building trust is just really important.
Yeah. But I am impressed how you got sausage into a trade panel, so congratulations on that one. Rebecca, let's talk about trust. We heard from Samir on trust. How can we get the UK to work with like-minded countries, perhaps where we've got a common goal, to really strengthen those services relationships and moving forward?
So I think integrating what everybody has said so far, it is actually about understanding where the common ground is. So we do need those agreements to be multilateral in terms of standardization. So Stephen's point is an extremely well-made one, which is the problem with services trade is that you require this thing called a level playing field, and the thing called the level playing field is almost by definition not level. I mean, people don't want that level playing field to be level because, as Stephen said, it conflicts with national interests. And, there are all sorts of considerations around this which will always come to play. So I think what we have to do is identify where the common standards are. And again, I keep banging on about it because I was very heavily involved, as a lot of us I'm sure were, with COP and so on. And the ESG dimension around all of this is where we can all start from something that we all believe in. And I think this is something that's actually quite interesting in terms of our global relations as well, because it's a priority for the US government, it's a priority for the European government. European regulatory superpower structure is actually frightening banks at the moment because of the types of regulations that are coming through in taxonomies. So I think that's where we need to start. We need to start with something that we can all agree about, which is, we need some common-based standards for what we're doing and understand what it is, where we are willing to create that level playing field and where actually for national interest reasons or national security reasons we can't. And I think that's in a way where the whole debate around trade has actually pivoted over the last 5 years. So, I mean, whatever one thinks of what happened to trade over the last 5 years, trade was weaponized, it did become a conflict, it has become something that we talk about almost as a war now. Services somehow haven't yet got embroiled in that, but we are talking about tech wars. We are talking about sort of two-speed internets. I think this is a very risky point in time. And so if we can bring it back again around those standards and around well, we acknowledge now, the good thing that has come out of the last 5 years is we acknowledge now that there are national interests and national security attached to trade. A lot of them are through services. If we can accept that, then we can start to restructure our agreements accordingly.
Yeah, great. Catherine, you talked earlier about sort of business engagement and the importance of structures outside of free trade agreements. What institutions are critical, do you think, to the success of those?
What institutions?
Yeah, so
I think
to deal with outside of FTAs.
Business engagement, I do think just finding some way that the businesses can engage with the regulators or whoever else is having the dialogue. I'd hold up one example. We have the British American Finance Alliance, which is a cross-Atlantic coalition of trade associations. I happen to be the UK co-chair of that for City UK. And we feed into the Treasury to Treasury financial regulatory working group when they talk about regulatory issues, and not the trade agreement, but regulatory issues and what barriers there might be there. I think mechanisms like that, or the opportunity for the sector to feed into economic and financial dialogues, are just really useful ways for the policymakers and the trade negotiators to hear what the actual impediments people are finding in their day-to-day trading connections. So really that I think is the sort of thing I would suggest, alongside formalising some sort of regulatory dialogue or that, formalising that dialogue, making sure there is the connection for the sector to come in. Could I just, though, while speaking, pick up on what Rebecca's just said about the climate question being common ground? And I think you're absolutely right on that. I think it's ground on which we do need to work with work multilaterally and with other countries to find common baselines and interoperability of regulation and so on, because this is one area where it's in all our interests, global interests, to make sure that there are flows across border of services and finances and so on, so that we can actually turn the dial on this challenge. So yeah, let's focus on the areas where it's in all our interests to make things work and try to get some of those right.
And obviously something that the City of London has played a huge part in greening of finance and financing green. Maybe picking up on that, Stephen, obviously from a financial services perspective, how engaged are you in that dialogue, and is there anything you would like to see to facilitate that cross-border?
In terms of ESG?
Yeah.
Hsbc has recently appointed the Chief Sustainability Officer, which tells you that we're taking it very seriously, and we are indeed taking it very seriously. A lot of what Hsbc currently is doing is focused on ESG. I work for Hsbc only part-time. In my spare time, I sit on the board of an investment trust, and I can sort of think about this from a slightly different perspective, which is that I agree that ESG is something where everyone shares a similar view, but when it comes to very simple things like ranking companies on the basis of their ESG footprint, it's incredibly difficult. You can buy from third-party suppliers information as to whether company A is better than company B, but what you typically find is that one supplier gives you a completely different list to the other supplier. It's like sort of looking at a list of the greatest restaurants in the world, completely subjective. And so, although I agree that everyone can share that principle of ESG, I think when it comes to actual decision-making, whether it's at the national level, at the investment level, and so on, it is tricky. And part of the reason why it's tricky is that obviously within the concept of ESG, there are trade-offs. I mean, if you've got a company that has a brilliant E footprint, but a terrible S footprint, for example, is it investable or not? I mean, these are all tricky issues that I think don't give you immediate or simple answers. The other thing I would say is that when it comes to, this is not really connected to your question at all, actually, but I just want to say it anyway, which is that if you look at the UK currently, and this goes back to the government's levelling up agenda, 40% or so of the UK's exports of services are exports from London, and tells you partly about the dominance of financial services themselves in the UK. But it also suggests that you've put a lot of effort into opening up trade in services. It may be very good for London, which is great for me because I live in London. But in terms of levelling up the country as a whole, it may be something which isn't quite so obvious unless you simultaneously have a policy to try to shift some of those financial services and services more generally across the rest of the country. So there has to be distributional impact within the country itself. And the final comment I'd make, which goes back to Rebecca's observations earlier on, when it comes to sort of opening up countries and making sure that they trust you and they are aware of what you're trying to do and you're trying to do it in their best interests. I think we shouldn't forget that there is a tremendous level of suspicion in other parts of the world about the sorts of things that Britain or the US would tend to advocate. And I'm thinking here in particular of what happened many years ago during the Asian crisis. Now, the sort of consensus view about the Asian crisis is that it partly stemmed, not entirely stemmed, but partly stemmed from the overly rapid opening up of capital markets in Asia, which was something which, frankly, the vast majority of financial institutions in the West would have supported because it was a great opportunity for investment to pour into Asia. But we know in hindsight that this led to tremendous instability within those countries. The money that came in was not allocated effectively. The capital markets at home in those countries were not sufficiently developed. A lot of the money poured into risky real estate projects and so on. And so what might look good in the short run in terms of opening up may not be good in the longer run because of the institutional framework within individual countries. It's not a level playing field, and you have to recognize that. Interestingly, rather than focusing purely on Asia, this also happened effectively in the Eurozone because during the Eurozone crisis, it was partly caused by excessive levels of German savings looking for a safe home somewhere else. And the great advantage of investing elsewhere in Europe was that, well, the euro, there was no currency risk, so therefore why not pour loads of money into, say, Greece or Spain or Italy? I think at one point Greece had a current account deficit, balance of payments deficit, of about sort of 15, 16, maybe even 20% of GDP, which should have been a telltale sign that there was a problem. But in actual fact, it was a problem, but it wasn't reflected in currencies. It was reflected ultimately in sovereign debt markets. Yeah, I'm not sure that's an answer to your question, but it was slight deviation, I think.
Deviate away, Stephen.
Yeah, can I build on that deviation? Which is that, so this point about kind of London is super interesting. I mean, often, so having just spent some time in America, there's been a lot of chatter about essentially very concentrated losses because of trade liberalization, right? So big increase in imports from China, very concentrated costs of that on particular communities, and then the benefits of that in terms of lower prices, cheaper stuff being spread around. Right? When it comes to services exports, it's almost like the winners are very concentrated, right? And that itself presents a barrier for liberalisation. There's a kind of danger politically that you start to say, X will really hurt the city, and then some people are like, great, that's in some sense what we wanted, right? And so that, and I think this kind of connects to something that Rebecca was saying, which is, in a sense, I was talking earlier about trust. What we needed to do is to build trust. Perhaps something else we do is to make trade really boring. Maybe we need to lean in to the tedium and sort of get on with things in the background, these kind of annoying little barriers. Because when you start infusing economic barriers that it's possible to remove with the politics of sovereignty and demonstrating that you have the freedom to diverge, everything just gets quite unstable and perhaps unproductively so.
Rebecca, I know you were keen to come in on the ESG and data
Yes, absolutely.
debate. So do you...
Absolutely, but it actually ties into the let's make trade boring element as well. And I think one of the thing I wanted to say was you've got very large supranational organisations and trade associations like the International Chamber of Commerce who are working between financial services and businesses to develop those types of standards. So one of the things that came out the week before last during COP was a statement from the ICC that these are the basic standards that we need to start thinking about. So let's not think about what we don't know, let's think about what we do know, and we do know about sustainable development goals, and we do know how those structure across economic, social and governance issues, and therefore we can start to build a framework from that in terms of how trade finance and everything else can build around it. Now, that's going to take some time to do, and we can't wait for the regulators, and it is incredibly boring and dull while the regulators get their heads around everything and policymakers get their heads around everything as well. But there is a move to start standardising things, and it is collaborative between business and financial services and trade associations and international organisations. And I think the more the UK can start getting involved with those types of things, the better it's going to be, because they are leading edge international organisations that aren't free trade areas that are leading the agenda. And the other thing I would say, going back to my point about digitisation right at the beginning, the UK is leading on changing the law in digital trade, and that is something where we can have a big influence because it is in everyone's interests to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you've about 10 minutes left, and I wouldn't want to come off this stage without discussing services and trade in the EU. So, Samir, you talked about trust, which will be potentially relevant to this conversation. Do we think that we can see an enhanced trade deal on services with the EU? I know quite a lot of people are disappointed with where we ended up, but Catherine, I know you were advocating for a huge amount of change there. Do we think something more robust is possible? So I'll come to you first, Catherine.
So, where we are at the moment, it's interesting that you use the word trust. I mean, clearly at the moment, the relationship is overshadowed by the political temperature. And I think the sooner that we can get back for the financial professional services sector to a bit more of the boring and some of the issues that are tedious, the better, actually. I mean, we'd love to see that MOU activated so that we've got a framework for regulatory dialogue, but we know that the regulators get on pretty well anyway and talk. Look, let's face it, we are in a different relationship now. We're not likely to strike a particularly ambitious agreement with them on financial services, given where we are, but we are going to be trading with them and working with them into the future. Let's keep focusing with them on the issues of common concern. Let's face the fact that we are going to be dependent on each other into the future, and let's try to keep let's try to bridge over this difficult period politically, and show a bit more pragmatism. In a sense, you're drawing together the question of trust, where I'm afraid we hear wherever we go around the world, and not just in the EU, that our approach at the moment is making people question our trustworthiness if we're considering going back on agreements that we've signed. I know that's a challenging thing to say, but that is the message we're getting from around the world. So we're getting trust. Sausages, I won't go into the Northern Ireland Protocol. Fortunately, financial services don't take me into the protocol too often. But sausages certainly come into it somewhere, don't they? But I do think we need to be looking at what positive relationship we can forge into the future. And we find in our own bilateral dialogues that we hold with a number of the countries that they're very clear that they want to keep talking to us about long-term issues, about climate, about definitions, about how we can shape things together on those fronts. I think it is critical that we look at how we can move forward pragmatically through this challenging time.
Samara.
Yeah, I wouldn't have a whole lot to add. I mean, yeah, I think in the current environment it's just very difficult. But can I see something get better in the future? Yes, I think you're right in that the relationship between the regulators, the relationship between the people talking about financial services seems to be better than the relationship around other things, e.g. sausages. So that's a good thing. I mean, it could come down to very, very legalistic, techie stuff about jurisdiction, the European Court of Justice. A lot of these questions come down to who are you willing to, who is it okay to arbitrate, right? Who are you willing to allow to sort of question rulings made by different legal bodies, right? And at the moment, there's, the European Court of Justice is clearly just a very, very difficult issue. And, it seems to be a very political, is a very political issue. But, I'm an economist. I went into trade thinking I was going to, use all my economics, and then found out I was having to become a pretend lawyer. All the legal stuff really, really matters about defaults and precedents and all that stuff. So I think we just need to give it a bit of time and then take a more reasoned approach to what that legal framework could be.
Great, thank you. Maybe we'll take the last question around fintech. We've talked about green, we've talked about ESGs, and the UK is really leading on, and very much seen as a global leader on fintech as well. Now, Rebecca, this is something you're particularly interested in. What can government and trade negotiators do to really help UK fintech expand its overseas footprint and take advantage of trade negotiations?
I think agreements on data are the most important thing here. So, I speak as a fintech owner, a founder, an entrepreneur, and the big thing for us at the moment is where our data is located, and how we share our data across borders, and the restrictions that are now in place around sharing borders has massively increased our costs. And as a result of that, we're in a position where we're making decisions based on whether or not we can actually afford to open up another data node somewhere, and that's a very difficult thing. Now, the problem that a lot of fintechs are trying to address is to enable financial services, big investment houses, big banks to develop ecosystems around them that will mean that they don't necessarily have to do some of the nitty-gritty around regulation or some of the nitty-gritty around data aggregation or whatever it might be. We need those types of companies to be understood. We need to have the flexibility for people to move about between countries. We need to have the flexibility to move data between countries, and we need to be incorporated. We need to have a seat at the table, effectively, to understand that the fintech sector is woven into the fabric of banking these days. And I know Stephen is actually in a bank, and so I won't speak on behalf of Hsbc, but certainly our clients see a lot of the work that fintechs do as absolutely critical in that whole sort of financial services and regulatory and liquidity umbrella, the fintechs underneath are actually driving some of the change in financial services, particularly in trade finance, from where things always used to be manual to things being digital, and that's where we're leading the way. A lot of these companies are very small, very vulnerable. There are, I think the other thing is UK export finance really should be thinking about the guarantees for services companies. It's much harder to get export finance as a services company than it is as a goods company. There you are, wish list. Dear Father Christmas.
And Stephen, maybe on that, I mean, most banks like to call themselves fintechs now, I think, as far as I can see. But you obviously do work with a lot of the fintechs and taking those services in from wherever they are. You know, it's just something that you're focused on.
It's not my area of speciality, I have to admit, but it is incredibly important for Hsbc and it's incredibly important for other banks. But this comes back actually partly to the regulatory question. A few years back, Hsbc was quite keen on trying to open networks in other countries which are effectively virtual networks as opposed to physical networks, which is effectively where banking in many ways is going. But the regulatory environment in those countries prevented you from doing it. So although from a sort of cost and productivity perspective, it was something that was actually very, very attractive in terms of how each country dealt with that and saw that kind of entry as a kind of challenge to its existing high street network, for example. That's where you tend to get significant restrictions coming through. Having said that, you know, banks as a whole have had a kind of Japanese-type problem over the course of the last few years. Low inflation, low growth, very low interest rates, flat yield curves. None of these sorts of things are terribly good news for banking profitability. And so the importance of trying to improve productivity to boost profits becomes that much greater. And therefore engagement with fintech is an absolutely vital part of the whole story. So if it turns out that the regulatory environment across borders is inconsistent with the ability to grow fintech or to take advantage of fintech, then you've got a significant problem in terms of the bank, its share price, and so on and so forth. But these things really matter. I want to mention one other thing actually on the earlier question about the UK and Europe, and it goes back to a couple of conversations I had many, many years ago. And it's about trust, actually. And this was before the euro was created. This is a long time ago. And the German policymaker said to me, he said, Stephen, if you've got any influence whatsoever on the UK government, can you please persuade them to join the euro, because we in Germany on our own can't trust the French. And then a little later on, I had a conversation with a French policymaker, which was exactly the same. And I think, you know, in one sense, we should recognize that the UK did play a very important role, not just in terms of its sort of bilateral relationship with the whole of Europe. It played a very important role as a kind of almost like an umpire or referee from time to time to deal with other countries within Europe which are having their own disagreements. And of course, it is more difficult for the UK to play that role at the moment. That itself may create some difficulties. The other euro-related issue I wanted to raise is that when the euro was first created and when Britain was not part of the euro, there are a lot of people who are predicting that it would mean the demise of London as a major financial centre. And certainly I think it's fair to say that both France and Germany looked at this and thought this is a great opportunity to shift finance to either Paris or to Frankfurt, and you're seeing similar kinds of arguments coming through today. But it is worth stressing, I think, that financial centres depend partly on the sort of ghastly economics term of network externalities, that if lots of other people are there in that financial centre and have lots of expertise, then you too can benefit and be lifted from that connection. It does take an awful lot, I think, to shift from one financial centre to another, and in that sense, I think that London, regardless of Brexit and the ambitions perhaps of France and Germany, because of network externalities still, will be a dominant force in terms of financial and professional services.
So we basically have to just keep hoping they keep arguing with each other.
Yeah.
I think we're out of time now, and thank you so much to my panel. I think we've covered a pretty wide debate over the topics of standardisation, our standards, keeping up the industry dialogue, and the role of business, and I would certainly agree with that. But also importantly on digitisation and the data opportunities, making sure we define our services to trade the problems with blurred lines between trade and services, and we managed to get vinyl and tobacco and sausages into that. But I think the one thing I took away is the future of our trade negotiations is trust, and hopefully that will lead us into our dinner debate later. Thank you to all my panellists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. There'll now be a very